Hey guys, thanks so much for watching my capstone video. So for my capstone, I analyzed a series of different dives and provided a detailed deconstruction for each. In this video, I will be showing you several different dives and explaining mistakes that were made and or what the diver did correctly. In addition, I showed these same dives to a high-level coach in the diving world and included his feedback. So let's get started. This dive is incredibly clean. There is a slight splash on the entry which could be caused to saving just a bit early. Saving, or an underwater entry, is when a diver breaks the water with their hands, bringing their arms to a T shape, and then bringing their hips to a 90-degree angle once their hips are underwater. Here's an example of a diver from an underwater view saving a dive. Hopefully that gave you guys a better idea as to my previous explanation of underwater entries. It is important to understand that the technique below the water is just as important as the technique above it, and there are several common mistakes divers make upon entry. Specifically for this dive, though, I would guess that as she enters the water and begins the pike save, the rotation from her dive slightly continues, causing her feet to make a small splash as she completes the rest of the underwater entry. This would have been less likely to have happened if she had waited maybe a millisecond longer to begin the entry because her feet would have already entered the water completely, preventing the splash. Generally, at a high level diving meet, the camera will show the diver entering the water in addition to the actual dive. Unfortunately, in this case, they did not, so it's difficult to say with complete certainty that this is what happened. Overall, Wu Mingxia is known for her consistency, and even if she does have a slight mistake somewhere in a dive, you almost have to look for mistakes when she's diving because they're rarely easy to spot.
My name's Nunzio Espasto, and I'm the head diving coach at Duke University. I think that it was a beautiful dive. It was an inward 2.5 pike, and I think that her throw could have been just a little higher on the takeoff. The dive was just a little bit cut off, and but I think she did a great job with it. It was very, very clean, and I think that it resulted in a score of 8, 8.5. So overall, really good.
Here, David Bodaya executes an exceptional dive. He maintains clean form in the air and tight lines from start to finish, as well as having a remarkably clean entry for such a difficult dive. What's interesting about this is that David Bodaya has been a tower diver since he dove collegiately. After winning a gold medal at the Rio Games 4 years ago, he decided to switch to springboard and has been training for Tokyo in this event. The biggest difference between the two events is, in the case of platform, divers must create the power, momentum, rotation, and distance themselves, and in the case of springboard, divers must learn to be patient and ride the board, because it will largely provide them with everything they need to complete the dive. Springboard divers must know and understand how to work with the board and not against it. Otherwise, they won't get the momentum, rotation, height, power, and sometimes even distance needed to do dives with a high degree of difficulty. It is incredible to see the smoothness of his transition between these two events.
And watching that dive, uh, he could have, coming off the board, he could have reached a little bit higher, a little more square. He was a little quick coming off the board with his shoulder. And then on the come out, he could have, coming out of the twist, just squared up, meaning he could have brought that top arm a little higher over his head coming out of the twist and lifting his chin so that it resulted in just a little bit straighter in entry.
David Bodaya made a big change from platform to springboard. Would you say he's adjusted well?
He's adjusted very well, and I think that in college he was a very good springboard and platform diver. And then once he started vying for, Olympic spots, sometimes whenever that happens, the divers tend to specialize in one event over the other. But I also think that, he's done very well in platform at the last several Olympics. And because of his age, that may be a factor. When you dive springboard, it's a little easier on your body. So I think that's what has happened in his case. And I'm not sure how long he'll be diving, but hopefully he'll be diving next summer in our Olympic trials that were postponed this year.
So, what qualifies a diver to be more prone to platform or springboard?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things that help with platform diving versus springboard. Number one would be you have to be a daredevil to go off of a platform that's 32 feet in the air. And I think the other thing is you have to be very good at using your visual cues, because there's not a lot of room for air from 32 feet in the air. So the better you are with your visual cues, meaning you're spotting in the air and knowing where you're at whenever you're spinning, that's going to result in a better, dive, regardless of which dive it is. And that's really important whenever you dive tower, because there's not, as like I said, there's not as much room for air when you're up there that high. The other thing would be, with springboard, your timing has to be really, really in tune with the diving board, and you have to be pretty strong to dive springboard. And I think that on platform, you don't have to deal with the rhythm of the springboard, and sometimes divers that aren't quite as strong in the legs are good platform divers.
Overall, this was not Michael Hickson's best dive. One of the most challenging aspects of diving to master is the hurdle and the consistency of it. The takeoff sets up the dive for either failure or success, so because his hurdle did not give him the setup he needed, he struggled to finish this dive well. All was smooth until the end of the hurdle. As he takes off the board, his knees buckled, preventing him from utilizing the full momentum of the board. This loss of momentum made it difficult to gain the full rotation for this dive, leaving him short. You'll notice that in an effort to compensate for this error, he squeezed his tucker's knees tighter to his chest and pulled them slightly apart to maximize his rotation, a strategy sometimes referred to as cowboying. This technique is not taught or recommended because it could result in the loss of points during a competition. However, it is used in situations like this when a diver needs the added rotational speed to finish the dive. Unfortunately, there is very little a diver can do to prevent the knee buckle from happening. However, it is how they respond to it that is important to note. In this situation, Michael Hickson did everything he could to recover, and overall, he recovered well.
So if a knee buckle happens, I think it depends on how badly the knees buckle. Sometimes, if it's slightly, you can adjust coming off the board. You can maybe reach a little bit higher, or you can get in a little bit tighter tuck, meaning you'll have to squeeze that tuck really tight, especially if it's on 3.5 somersaults, in order to make it, because if those knees didn't buckle, then you would obviously have a little bit more height on the dive. Those are a couple things that he could have done. And then if the knees buckle dramatically, unfortunately, it may result in a failed dive. I think that if the knee buckle wouldn't have happened, being as good of a diver that he is, then he wouldn't have had to compensate for some of those other things. But did a great job with it.
For this direction, although not as demanding as a forward approach, one of the most difficult things to do is maintain balance and patience. As I mentioned earlier, the board is meant to help the divers so long as they work as a team. A lot of times, when a diver becomes anxious, which commonly happens at meets, they can rush through the dive instead of taking the time to execute the movements as they know them. When they do get rushed, however, their shoulders and chest will oftentimes lead the dive instead of their arms. This causes the dive to have a horizontal direction instead of a vertical direction because they did not wait to gain the full power of the board. In this dive, however, Jordan Windle gives a near perfect example of the takeoff and execution of this dive with nearly no splash. Although his head positioning was a little bit off as he entered the water, this was barely noticeable and it affected his dive very little.
If you watch Jordan, when he comes out of the water, he looks at his coach and he kind of tilts his head backward. And I think he knows exactly what he did or what he could have done a little bit differently is just put his head back and keep it back as he was entering the water, and just would have made it just slightly a bit different. Um, so yeah, I had the pleasure of teaching Jordan that 2.5 pike on 3 meter because I was his coach for several years.
This dive was overall really well executed, however, his entry was a bit heavy. This was because his head was down on the start, which caused him to throw slightly down instead of up. And then throughout his dive, as he finished, his head was also down, causing him to kick late because he got lost. Um, and so that's why the entry was heavy, is because he went over because he kicked out late.
I think if he would have reached a bit more vertical coming off the board and kept his head up, his spotting would have been better. His sense of where he's at in the air would have been better. And then he would have known to kick at the right position. But because his head was down and he started off that board a little bit incorrect, then he ducked his head and that resulted in the dive going over.
Originally, my capstone focused on the mechanics of the hurdle and the physics of diving in general. In studying that, I realized my love for the sport went so much deeper than mindlessly going through the motions or even simply getting better. I wanted to understand the movements and components of a dive and the action reaction effects of those movements. I wanted to delve beneath the surface of the sport and deconstruct dives, investigate and understand the whys behind them, and then reconstruct them again. As I began this process at the beginning of this semester, I became conscious and aware of mistakes I was making in my own diving, and I could see dramatic improvements once I started working towards fixing them. I changed my capstone, however, due to the closure of pools from the coronavirus. I have been analyzing video online and put together a video that I think has captured a wide variety of elements and components. I became very comfortable with iMovie and gained skills about digital editing that I will carry with me and use in the future. I found I really enjoyed this aspect of my capstone because I am very detail oriented and the editing process allowed me to hone in on this. Overall, my capstone has helped me continue to grow in character and persevere, to pivot when obstacles arose. I am thankful I have had the opportunity to do this project because I have learned so much about myself throughout this process. I have learned to be patient and give myself grace when I don't get everything I want to get done finished. In addition, I have learned to set more reasonable goals for myself so as not to overwhelm myself. The time away from my sport has taught me to enjoy every moment because you don't know when your last one will be. But most of all, it has taught me the importance of finishing strong. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching my capstone video. I really hope you guys enjoyed it.